Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Digital Lab Ops Revolution, Improving Time to Science, CapEx and OpEx. I am Cassie Saltman of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Lab Design Tool. To learn more, visit www.labdesigntool.com. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. You may also submit any technical issues here as well if you're having any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation. I'd like to now welcome our speakers. Jake Haworth, Associate Director of Operations at Moderna, Hans Wernke, VP of Strategic Accounts at Lab Design Tool, powered by Kaon Interactive, Rouan Tulloch, Digital Services and Software Sales Specialist at Agilent, and David Gould, Senior Product Manager at Lab Design Tool, powered by Kaon Interactive. I'll now read through our discussion topics for today's webinar. We are going to cover today's top challenges, asset management, space and design planning, transforming digitally, and getting to science faster. David, I'll hand it over to you to begin your portion of the presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining, everyone. So lab operations are experiencing a range of different challenges throughout their life cycle, some more critical than others, depending on the environment, both macro and microeconomics, as well as the overall business goals. Many challenges in the industry include sustainability, increasing equipment utilization, improving workflow throughput, data integrity, even space utilization, asset tracking, and so much more. So addressing these challenges is a key focus of a lab's digital transformation. And the goals typically center around efficiency, reliability, saving time and money, and ultimately achieving faster time to science, which is a huge competitive advantage if you can achieve it. Now, the road to any digital transformation is not easy. And while every organization will approach it somewhat differently, in the end, it will involve the adoption of a range of industry solutions and tools, working with partners both inside and outside of your organization, from IoT in the cloud to artificial intelligence, and even things as mundane sounding as modular furniture that can be rearranged swiftly and easily. And there can be significant challenges to being an early adopter of new technologies, but early adopters often become leaders, and as they save time and increase efficiencies, they become that much more competitive, and research has shown that it can become that much harder and more costly for laggards to catch up. Lab operations are painfully aware of the many challenges that can and need to be addressed. And as just one small example, a recent Agilent survey of lab managers told us that 83% of their lab workflows felt that they needed optimization, and 63% of those would welcome innovations to increase efficiency. So according to PwC's recent Next in Pharma and Life Sciences report in 2023, over half of chief financial officers are pushing digital transformation initiatives. And what we know is that successful transformation and innovation is continuous and it's accelerating. And technology needs to be applied to the very core of how a company operates and how it competes. And continuous transformation requires a growth mindset, a different way of leading an organization. And we know that a scattershot approach to digital will not work. Organizations need to evolve from just doing digital to being digital. And that requires a transformation playbook with a cohesive vision. And in the early stages of doing digital, that's where you may be applying digital capabilities in an ad hoc manner without a cohesive vision. But being digital means designing and implementing a differentiating digital strategy and incorporating it into the organization's DNA. Now, each challenge area that you attack will likely be at different stages in this evolution, but it all starts with digital awareness. It starts with understanding where you are in lab digitization, and as part of a larger strategy, it involves aligning with stakeholders and leadership. And at the foundation level, it's about building a digital base for success. And this is where the rubber meets the road, where you're investing in and implementing solutions. And you're doing this with leadership support and operationalizing those capabilities in new and innovative ways while also measuring your ROI. And digital leaders transform into digital enterprises to stay ahead in the race to operational excellence. And ultimately, digital mastery is about being best in class by driving capital excellence and ultimately reducing time to science. And a key part of your digital transformation strategy is the vision, encompassing what you want to focus on, why, when, and how. One key area of focus and vision for many lab ops teams in their transformation playbook is centered around change management. And this lab change management life cycle is just a framework, but it gives you an idea around many of the challenges and how fluid that a lab can be during all the different operational change areas. It can often start with a new lab design where all the planning and execution happens to support key objectives, infrastructure, personnel, safety protocols, operating procedures, and so much more. And it's during these operations that there's continuous change occurring all throughout the life cycle. During operations in particular, it can be around new workflows, upgrading and replacing equipment, shifts in space layout and utilization, updates to health and safety and other regulations, sustainability initiatives, and even equipment moving from one location to another. Other cycles include lab scaling, which comes into play with periodic relocations, consolidations, and expansions, and of course, ongoing optimization and continuous improvement initiatives, which then can result in best-in-class labs that ultimately become models or gold standards within an organization for best practices and training. A key point here is how exponential the change can become throughout a life cycle of a lab, from initial design and operations to ongoing optimizations. The point being, there are incredible opportunities for digital transformation to reduce cost, time, resources, and increase time to science throughout this entire life cycle. And so in that lab life cycle, there are so many different stakeholders that play crucial roles, and their alignment is essential. They each have diverse goals, perspectives, and communication styles, which represents challenges around group communication, trust, and buy-in. And so no matter what transformation you're going after and whatever tools you're employing, you're often dealing with conflicting objectives, communication barriers, unspoken assumptions, and often a limited understanding of each other's role. And this can significantly delay or stall projects altogether. So you need to be thinking about ways to foster better understanding, greater collaboration as early as possible in any change management process, and specifically around the methods and tools that you're employing. And you do that in a way that is transparent and adds value, meaning it gets people to both better understand and share their experiences early in the process before it's too late. Implementing digital transformation methods and tools that foster collaboration can help move that transformation along quicker and easier. And so the pharma industry is facing a multitude of challenging trends. According to a report by McKinsey in the past, many pharmaceutical companies had deprioritized operation strategies in the face of competing business pressures, but now that's changing. To maintain profitable and resilient operations, there's a need to make bold changes to operational strategies. Now is the time to pave a way toward becoming digitally driven versus digitally enabled. And companies that truly scale and implement digital can better protect themselves from the pressures of the forces increasing costs in the industries. And so as we begin to talk about those different industry transformations in this webinar, I'm going to introduce Jake, and he can talk to us about some of his operational challenges that are taking place at Moderna. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. My name is Jake Haworth. I'm a director of operations at Moderna Therapeutics. I've been at Moderna for a couple years, and prior to this, I've been in operations about 10 years in total. Prior to that, I had a scientific background starting as a biochemist, and then quickly decided that pipetting was not for me. My experience prior to Moderna was in a variety of startups in academia and DOE labs at Sandia National Laboratories. And across the space here, as we're now looking at what our organizations are doing, operations is a huge driver in the strategy. If you're looking at a variety of cycles that David was talking about, from growth and operational efficiency and build outs, things like that, those are all things we're doing at Moderna right now. So to set the stage for that, a few years ago, early 2020, we were about 500 people. We're now about 5,000. So in the last few years, we are dealing with growth. We're dealing with leapfrogging through technologies to become best in class and industry standard. We're looking at doing build outs, and we're trying to hit operational excellence objectives. So looking at those operational excellence areas, the strategy that we're thinking about is that the investment in operations and efficiency is a multiplicative impact on our overall bottom line and efficiency for the lab. So for example, when we're giving a lab manager who's responsible for, let's say, 100 people, for the operations for the lab, for how they buy stuff, for how they receive items, for how they do anything that's in the lab space, if those scientists are spending 2 hours of their day doing, or 2 hours per week for receiving stuff, for doing procurement, and that lab manager can design a process to have that, you're getting 50 hours back for your scientific community, or depending on your efficiencies gained. So we see this as a huge ROI return for investment in efficiency and process-based operations. Aside from my role at Moderna, I'm also on the board of directors for Lab Ops Unite, which is a 501c nonprofit. We became an organization during COVID to meet some of these challenges that ops folks were facing with supply chain issues and things of that nature. And we created a community for people to share information and develop best practices. We now have mentorship programs. We're working academic programs to make this a more defined career track. We have over 700 members globally now. And so the challenges that we're seeing across the landscape are pretty consistent with what David was talking about. It's all of them. It's people don't have enough space. It's that our operations have grown at a much slower rate than the rest of the company. It's trying to make things efficient for the lab managers and being able to support a team with a digital footprint. If you're looking at the opportunities we have within Moderna, for instance, we're going through, as I was saying, a leapfrog in technology. So we do have a unique opportunity being a young company where we had been doing things, inventory of consumables, sample management, stuff like that on Excel. And now we can make a whole change into something like benchling, a more stratified, structured data capture without iterations in between. And so while it presents an opportunity, what we're struck with is trying to figure out what's the top priority. Our goal and our North Star in all of these operations challenges is to make sure that really we exist so that the scientists can focus on science. So anything we can do to increase their time that's doing science and remove other burdens, remove other barriers to make their processes efficient in doing science or doing areas that are not science that support those activities, that's our goal. So to some specific examples of challenges at Moderna, going from obviously 500 to 5,000 in a couple of years has led to, for instance, space constraints. And to make accurate space planning decisions for the footprint of our portfolio and to understand what our research needs are specifically, we have done a few things. So for instance, there's a variety of companies who do space monitoring. So equipment monitoring are other things we can talk about later. But in terms of space monitoring, there are different programs. You can use the variety of vendors where you have your scientists actually wearing a Bluetooth or RFID or a different badge reader or a badge on their person, and then readers throughout the space. And you can understand what is the usage of these different areas of tissue culture rooms, of different open lab benches and stuff like that. most times scientists, historically understanding the phase shift of how you do operations, the old school way of thinking is, I'm a scientist, here's my one bench, here's where I have my pipettes, here's where I have my minifuge, my vortexer, here's where I do my work. And that doesn't work anymore, because really that scientist is setting up some experiments, they're going back to the lab, to the office, they're synthesizing data, they're reading papers, they're going back, getting more data, going back to an ELN, doing entries outside of the lab, things like that. And so what we've seen is that we could increase our footprint by 2 to 3x of number of people in the lab without impacting science. But that's only going to be understood if you have data. Because if you talk to a scientist and you look at a lab that has 30 benches and you have 30 scientists, that's sort of the status quo. We don't have room for anyone else. So this has pushed a phase shift in how we do operations, how we are efficient with our space and our footprint. So space planning is one, starting from a data-based way of understanding our usage of the labs. And this is also part of the equipment usage of the lab. So things like a biosafety cabinet, things that are high-end capital equipment that need to be shared across teams. So you're not ordering this team here, unaware of what this team has and what they're using. So we've rolled out new solutions for scheduling of equipment, for scheduling of biosafety cabinets, for scheduling of anything that's a capital shared piece of equipment like a flow cytometer, mass spec, etc. And this is going to be driving our CapEx purchasing in the future, and understanding we don't need this team to have this piece of equipment, a flow cytometer or whatever, that this team also is using in its same functional workflow, but they're only separated by department barriers or silos, things like that. So using these digital tools to both understand our usage of the space, to understand what we can expand into if we're creative for how we share and collaborate and use both space and equipment, and then a phase shift in how scientists are using the space. It's not, this is my bench, this is my desk, that sort of thing. It's what do I need to do my science, in assigning areas by function and using that as your North Star. Those are sort of the main challenges we've been facing. There are other areas we've looked at in terms of just operational excellence and digital solutions. So for instance, there was a shift over from using paper notebooks to lab notebooks, into now we're implementing another or an updated ELN to make sure that our data is captured in a robust way, that it's easily, finding the fair practices where it's findable, accessible, etc. So that's also very important for making our teams efficient, so that anyone can come in who needs to access this experiment to know where to find data. So it's automated. We can use automated workflows for analyzing data if it's structured and captured in the same way. I spoke about the sample management side as well, but for instance, there we are moving a shift into benchling for different types of sample management, inventories of freezers. I know in the digital space and the IT space, we are looking at opportunities to make this even more efficient. So there are options such as digital twins for lab IT to understand what's in the lab and come in and fix experiments or fix instruments that are associated with experiments. So for instance, you've got a computer that is powering a mass spec. It's in a giant lab. A lab IT person comes in, they don't know what a mass spec looks like or where it is. So a digital twin can be a pathfinder for them to understand what the computer is, what equipment it's associated with. And this all ties into the new rollout we had in our scheduling system. So for instance, we rolled out a platform called Booked. There's Cluster Market, there's many other scheduling tools out there. But this is a place where all our teams can efficiently coordinate amongst each other. So you've got a mass spec that goes down, or let's say it needs an IT update. Your IT team can book time on that machine, so it's not impacting R&D experiments. You can have your vendor rep or your equipment vendor who's supporting different reps coming in from OEM, or your own team who's doing that management of that program, block time for updates, for calibration, certifications, etc. And you can much better coordinate across each other because there's multiple teams who are competing for time on an instrument, not just for science, but for support, maintenance, etc. And we believe that the most science is the most important part. And so your scientific team, if they have a critical experiment, within one platform. They can push to Outlook and calendars and things like that, have one space where they can say, no, I need it in this time slot to run this experiment for this program, whatever. So a lot of what we're doing in terms of the digital space is addressing these challenges, moving from the status quo of how things have been operating to where they can operate, both from a business efficiency practice to a lab operational excellence practice, and then how can these teams be efficient across each other and cross-functionally. So just the last thing I wanted to say about this is that at least at Moderna, the only constant we have is change. So there's constantly changes in that 500 to 5,000 people, changing priorities, changing strategic initiatives in terms of our scientific programs, how much space we have, how much space we need, what the build out is for, when we're going to move, and then different priorities for the research teams, different priorities for how operations can support them. So one of the most important underlying features of all these programs is that they're flexible and adaptable, and that we can pivot as needed. So we don't want to get locked into a particular ELN that cannot be supported with a new system, or if we migrate away, we're going to have a whole year-long process to do that. We want to always be thinking about, and what if this changes, and how do we keep that updated, and how do we keep that updated, and what are the contingencies that are built into the system? So when you structure data, when you have a more structured and organized approach, it makes all of those processes downstream much easier. So I just would strongly advocate for people to make sure that that is a component on whatever they're building out in this lab operation space, especially as you have the opportunity to digitize with these new tools that are coming on. So with that, I'll kick it to Cassie for the next section. And I think we have a poll.
Yes, thank you, Jake. So up here on your screen in the slide component, there is a poll question we would greatly appreciate your response on. The poll asks, what are your top lab digital transformation investment areas for 2024? We do have a few options listed, so please take a moment to scroll through them and select the best one that fits for you. All right, go ahead and click on your responses. We'll give you just a few more moments here to record which is the best investment area for you for next year. All right. Thank you all for submitting your responses. I'm now going to pass it over to Rouan for your portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you, David and Jake. So I'm going to be talking about digital solutions for sustainable lab operations. My name is Rouan Tulloch. I'm the Digital Services Specialist at Agilent Technologies. I'm going to be starting with some of the things our customers are telling us, some of the hidden costs in lab operations from an operational point of view and a strategic point of view as well, how the Cross-Lab Connect tool can help optimize lab operations, and then I've got some real-life case studies as well, just to show some examples of what people are using it for. So first of all, what are our customers telling us? Well, with the current economic climate, of course, the number one thing is that people are trying to reduce overheads at the moment, but also sustainability has been a very hot topic, and most of our customers now have some kind of sustainability goal in place. And more of our customers are just saying that they want to know more about how their instruments are actually being used in the lab. So we've also carried out some surveys recently. So we asked 100 lab managers in the pharma sector what was the most important to them, and obviously the number one thing was speed and throughput that came out as the top priority. But also, I think David mentioned that a large number of these lab leaders would like to see tools to help them improve efficiency. And as I mentioned, a lot of our customers have sustainability goals in place. I think My Green Lab at the COP28 summit identified that the biopharma and biotechnology sector has the 22nd largest carbon footprint globally as an industry. So there's plenty of work to be done there. But a lot of these labs don't actually have concrete plans in place yet to achieve those goals. And we also found that the average utilization in the labs that are actually measuring it at the moment is pretty low. It was down about 35%, and we even found in some R&D labs it was in single figures. And only about 4% of the customers we spoke to are actually even trying to measure utilization in some kind of way. So let's take a look at those hidden costs, which certainly when I talk to customers, they're not always that apparent to them. In particular is instrument downtime. So if you break that down, it's when you have a problem with an instrument, you've then got to take time out of your main role to go and deal with that. You've got the lost productivity, of course, and then the wasted resources, either solvents or gases, depending on what kind of instrument it is. And if that's not on some kind of support contract, then you've got repair costs that go with that. And even once the instrument is fixed, you've then got to catch up with all the backlog or the samples that you haven't been able to analyze. Also, we see inefficiencies where high throughput labs have instruments that are maybe breaking down too often because they're being overutilized, so they're stressed. In our R&D labs, we see unused instruments where the labs have a high number of instruments for capability, but not really thinking about the cost of ownership of those instruments and the service contracts and the space they take up and things like that. And then when labs get new projects, they instantly think, oh yes, we've got to buy a new instrument, or they've got budget to use up, so yeah, let's buy some new kit. But do they actually really need that equipment? Because it's not just the cost of the purchase, you've then got all the space it takes up and the support contracts and everything else that goes with ownership. We also see a lot of human behavior in labs, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with the favorite instrument scenario, where you have 2 or 3 instruments that all run the same application, but the end users in the lab tend to favor one of those because it worked last time or some other reason. And then in regulated labs, we see a lot of over-maintaining instruments where end users will replace all of the consumables before running a sequence out of fear of that sequence not running to completion. So we looked at some of our statistics that we have on our service data, and we calculated that on average downtime is costing our customers about $5,000 per system per day. So I would ask that you think about breaking down what downtime costs your lab and how much it's costing you financially, which is probably a lot more than you think. So that's looking at it from an operational view. From a strategic point of view, we often think about return on investment when you purchase an instrument. So we might think about what we call the asset life cycle. So that's taking the life of the instrument from the planning stage when you're thinking about buying it, all the way through the operational phase, which is the use of the instrument, which you want to maximize to get the best return on that investment you've made on that very expensive piece of equipment. You've then got the maintenance part, which is interwoven with the operational phase, but you want to minimize that as much as possible to make sure you get that return on your investment. And then, of course, when it reaches end of life, you've then got to dispose of it, either replace it with a new model, or if that function is no longer required, replace it, dispose of it completely. So there are lots of questions that come up during that asset life cycle that are really difficult to answer. So whether you actually need to buy it, so how much capacity have you got in the lab? So do you actually really need it, or could you fulfill that role with the existing equipment? Have you got all the information you need to make that budget approval if you really do need that piece of equipment? And in that operational phase, how to make it run as efficiently as possible, so you use the fewest amount of resources. And then in terms of maintenance, are you doing the right amount of user maintenance? Have you got the right level of coverage for your service contract? Because that can have a big financial impact. And when exactly does that instrument become too expensive to continue using? When is the time that you need to actually replace it or dispose of it? So wouldn't it be great if our instruments could actually talk to us and tell us all this? In fact, if you look at a lot of manufacturing sites and their production plants, they already have this capability. So they use a strategy called predictive maintenance, where they'll have sensors on things like pumps and stuff like that. For example, on a rotary pump, you might have vibration sensors. And when those vibration sensors show that the vibrations exceeded a certain tolerance, then that will notify the central maintenance system, and then that pump will be allocated for routine maintenance the next time that production line is offline, so it has the least amount of impact on productivity. We can't quite achieve that yet in the lab. Lab instruments are quite complex, and even if you have a lot of the same instruments, they might be running different applications. So there isn't sort of a key parameter that you can measure to tell you when to do that maintenance. But we've been working towards that goal, and we've developed a tool called CrossLab Connect. So this can help you to make your instruments as reliable as possible by optimizing that maintenance, to give you all the information that you need so that you can plan your CapEx spending months, if not years, into the future. And when things don't go quite right and you do have an issue, we've got tools to help you to deal with that as quickly as possible so you can focus on the important things in your lab. And because it's driving efficiency, we're also improving sustainability as well. So CrossLab Connect is made up of 5 component parts. So we have a utilization data tool that can connect to just about any instrument, and it shows that utilization data in a variety of different dashboards so that you can make different comparisons. We have a diagnostic tool that can help you optimize user maintenance and also send you an email, for example, if there's a fault on an instrument. And then we have an inventory and service tool, which are both cloud-based, and that can cover your entire lab inventory. And having that accurate inventory means you can see exactly what instruments you've got. It's easy to update. So when you are looking to purchase a new instrument, you can see whether you actually need it when you look at the utilization data as well. And that service manager tool for the optimized service means you can place service requests just by scanning the instrument and making a couple of clicks describing the problem. So it's very easy to raise that service request. You can keep track of them and also see the last 3 years of your service history as well. And then we've recently introduced what we call asset lifecycle analytics. So this takes data from all of these components, plus some other service information from our SAP system. So you can actually see risk in your laboratory. So you can look at things like utilization against number of repairs for your instruments, or look at the 10 oldest instruments or the 10 most used instruments. So it's a great starting point before you start digging into some of the other dashboards for the other tools. So some of the real-life case studies where customers have taken advantage of these tools, for example, in the top row there, we've got a pharma lab which had just over 100 instruments. So they use data from all of those tools, and they migrated from a regular calendar plan maintenance schedule to a utilization-based schedule. So they were able to use our Smart Alerts tool to track the number of runs the instruments had done, and it would flag a warning when it reached a certain tolerance to advise them to book their planned maintenance visit. So they managed to reduce the number of planned maintenance visits that were as part of their service contract, and they saved over $45,000 by doing that. By knowing what the capacity they had in the lab from the utilization and inventory, they were able to avoid purchasing at least one instrument per year. So that's a saving of over $30,000 if you look at the average price of an instrument at the moment, and optimize the service coverage for each of their instruments. So from the context from the lab, so the criticality for those instruments and how much they were used, they then could make a much better informed decision on what service level they should have. Then we've got an R&D lab with 90 systems. So they looked at their utilization data over 12 months and their inventory, and they identified 16 systems that had hardly been used at all. So nobody really knew that these systems weren't being used until they looked at the utilization data. They had no way of redeploying them elsewhere in their organization, so they decided to retire them. So we brought in a third-party company to value them for them, and that came at just over $400,000. But also taking those 16 systems out of the lab meant their carbon footprint was reduced by over a ton of carbon dioxide per year. But it's not all about savings and sustainability. For example, on the fourth row there, you've got a toxicology lab with 15 systems. They were an independent lab that had been bought out by a much larger company, and they were worried that they were going to be shut down because they were too small and they weren't doing enough. So they started measuring utilization and reporting that to their parent company, and that was so successful they've actually expanded. So they've increased the number of instruments they have, and their throughput and profitability has gone up. So the benefits can really range quite widely, not just cost savings, efficiency and sustainability, but it can solve a whole host of other operational problems. But really I would ask if you can afford not to take advantage of these digital tools, because it can really show you things that you just can't see without them. So that's the end of my section there. So I think I'm handing over to Hans now.
Yes, thank you very much, Rowan. David, if you wouldn't mind going to the main slide, somehow they're not forwarding on my end right now. So that's a starting slide. So we've heard three stories, three perspectives on change. We heard David talk about the challenge in the lab ops space, the need for digital transformation, and the roadmap, the need to build a critical pathway to digital excellence to really support all the individual stakeholders across the lab lifecycle. Jake shared with us his perspectives through his lens and Moderna's lens and the Lab Ops Unite lens as well, but all the challenges that are being faced in the lab ops space and the specific steps that are being taken to address those challenges. And then Rowan just talked with us about the way that Agilent actually helps companies manage the digital transformation of the lab assets, lab asset tools, lab assets in general. So these are all stories of change. And what's interesting, change is an interesting concept, right? I believe it was Winston Churchill who said, to improve is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. So by that standard, we would actually say that all of you, all the people in this audience right now are absolutely perfect, because you all work in a highly dynamic functions, you work in highly dynamic industries. So there's one thing you know, it's that nothing will stay to change. So it'll stay the same. As Jake just said as well, the only constant that we know is change. Now, to be very clear, this is not a session on change management, but all the fundamentals of change management apply universally to all the topics that we're talking about today. Specifically, the topic that I want to share with you today is lab design and lab optimization. Oops. Sorry, it looks like I missed you. I lost you for a second. See, the research has shown, we've done extensive research over the last couple of years, and what we found is that a lot of companies are making very significant investments in certain specific areas. We're looking at how we're actually storing data, we're doing cloud storage, how we're managing our assets, and how we're actually managing our overall lab assets. So these are all very important areas. But the one thing where we find that companies are not quite spending enough time, it's on lab design and lab optimization. So David, if you wouldn't mind going to the survey slide, that's the last slide right now, so thank you. So I'm not actually seeing that right now. The reason why it's important, we ran a very comprehensive study in 2023 called the Lab Design Survey. We did that together with Lab Manager Magazine. And what we found is that there were specific areas that are critical and important to the companies that we're working with, to all the respondents that participate in the survey. So we see that's the optimization of space. It's the utilization of space. And all the areas you see on the slide outlined, they're very important clearly. So on the one hand, we decide that lab design, lab optimization is critically important. We know that. So then the question is everything ready in a good place? Do we have the right tools? Do we have the right processes in place to actually ensure that all of this is done well? What we're finding right now in conversations that we've had throughout our survey is that the lab design process, the lab optimization process is fraught with challenges, with issues. There are a lot of pain points in the process. People talk about miscommunication, about missed timelines, about cost overruns, about frustrations in the communication between the various stakeholders. So last week, as I mentioned to some of you before, we were at the Lab Asset Facility Management Summit in Boston. It was a great event. We met with a lot of great people, a lot of stakeholders across the industry, the lab planners, lab designers. We met with EHS people, with procurement people, and invariably when the topic started to get to the point where we talk about lab design, it's almost as if people's face dropped. Because what they would tell us is that the process is very painful. It takes too long. It's too expensive. There's too many people involved in the process. It's almost impossible to reach consensus. So there's too many challenges in this process overall. So on the one hand, we have a series of requirements that are absolutely critical. On the other hand, it's becoming very clear that the tools are not available to support that process. In fact, the one thing that I've really heard from 3 people over the last year is that it is almost as if we all speak a different language between the lab designers, the lab ops people, the scientists, the architects. It's as if we all speak a different language. And one thing that people have told me is that very often we might be looking at a 2D drawing. You might have 5 people looking at a 2D drawing or floor plan and a completely different spatial awareness of what this actually means, what it means today, and what it might mean tomorrow. So where does this issue come from? So David, if you might go to the next slide. We've identified that our theory is, we call it the digital transformation gap in lab design. So what we experience is that on one end of the spectrum, we have the internal stakeholders. The internal stakeholders, they're the lab designers, they're the lab ops people, we have the facility planners, the scientists. They're relegated to work with tools that are absolutely not designed to provide the level of support that's needed, that are not designed to facilitate the level of collaboration that's required between all the stakeholders in the process. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the technical experts, we have the internal technical experts, and we have the architects. And the architects and the internal technical experts all work with highly sophisticated tools, purpose-built tools that absolutely play a very important role in the process, but they tend to only be usable by a few number of people, a small number of people, because they're also the experts in that space. They tend to be expensive. The turnaround time tends to be slow. And as a result, we're not really getting the results that we're looking for. And that brings us back to the challenges that we outlined before. So what we're looking for is a way to change that old dynamic, to change perspective, to bridge the gap between the internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, between the tools that are being used right now internally. And to give you an example, when we talk about the internal tools, people are using PowerPoint, they're using graph paper, we have multi-billion-dollar companies telling us that they're using physical spaces with cardboard boxes with duct tape on the floor, or sometimes they even use Lego to design labs and to visualize what a lab might look like. Now, I'm all for Lego. I think it's a really, really great toy and a great tool, but not for lab design. So again, when we think about the tools you see outlined on this slide, they all serve a purpose. And I also want to be very clear, the architects play an absolutely critical role in the process as well. But we're thinking about whether it is you're building a new facility or you are making updates to your current lab facilities, just on a day-to-day basis. You're moving a freezer, or you're being told that the new person is going to move into the lab. How do you create space, and how do you actually make that happen? You don't want to have to go to the architect every single time you need a new drawing. Because as we've been told, and as we experience a lot of times, it might take a couple of weeks. It might take time, gets expensive. And by the time that your drawing comes back, it might already be obsolete because more changes have been made. So what we're really looking at, and David, if you could start the video, is an opportunity process a solution that can help you optimize this process, that can help drive optimal efficiencies in the process, operational efficiencies, and a closer time to science. So one of these solutions is the lab design tool. So the lab design tool was initially developed to really significantly increase the speed of science, to increase the efficiencies and effectiveness in the lab optimization process. And the way to do this by building a digital twin of the existing space, but also the future space, and collaborating in real time with all the stakeholders to ensure that these changes that you're making, as you see the video playing out right now, all these changes are being made in real time. So envision having the stakeholders sitting around the metaphorical table and making these changes in real time, and then automatically see a 3D render, a real-time 3D render of that space. You immediately have that spatial awareness of what this is going to look like. So what we find time and again is that when companies use this kind of tool, a lab design tool, they see a significant reduction in the number of iterations that they have to go through, a 3-time reduction in labor costs, and a 79% reduction in time to group consensus. So these are all the reasons why there's a reason for a different tool. And once again, I don't need to belabor the point, but it is important. There is a need for the tools, for the AutoCADs, for your Revits and the Blueprints. They all serve a very specific purpose. We're not suggesting that you replace those tools. What we're suggesting is that you augment those tools with a solution such as the lab design tool to really ensure, to empower all the stakeholders in the process to be part of that ongoing discussion around the change that needs to take place. Going back to the statement that we made before, that change is the only constant. We hear time and again that companies have spent a lot of time, a lot of effort developing a lab. By the time it's day one, it already needs to be changed, because people might walk in and say, well, that's not quite what I had in mind. That's not what I thought it was going to look like. So having a tool that allows you to work in real time, to collaborate in real time across all your stakeholders is going to drive significant improvements in operational efficiencies and significant improvements in speed to science. And with that, I'm handing it over back to Cassie.
Thank you for that. I believe we're now going back over to David, but this is the perfect opportunity to submit any questions you may have for our speakers to participate in the live Q&A at the end of our webinar today.
Wonderful, thank you. This is a great opportunity. We're going to have a group share of some transformations that have happened in the lab to give everyone some recent examples. I can start off by just giving an example where, again, it's a little bit focused on the lab design in general, but we want to speak to all digital transformations, not just around design and layout. We did several interviews with pharma companies in Boston and California, and we heard some of the same things that Hans was talking about, some of the challenges they were having in using digital tools to do their transformational layouts on an ongoing basis. Was really able to help them eliminate some of the issues they were having around projects that took 4 months and had to be scrapped due to lack of stakeholder buy-in. There were relocation projects that literally would take 3 weeks or more to do between all the different stakeholders, and now they would be able to operationalize that down to 3 or 4 hours, getting efficient buy-in from all the stakeholders. So they're reducing labor costs, they're reducing their risks, and ultimately even reducing downtime by getting their changes quickly, efficiently, and done right the first time around. I wanted to open it up for Jake and Rouan and others to share any kind of transformations they might be able to bring forth.
Sure, I'm happy to speak about a new system we've been looking at for equipment monitoring. So we've had equipment monitoring for years, but never to the level that we're looking at now. We have, several thousand pieces of equipment within our research environment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we had 20, 30 monitors over the last few years, but in the last year, we're now looking at expanding to about 200. So this would be on all of our mass specs, NMR, flow cytometers, things like that. because so much of our CapEx spend is just expanding with the growth of the team, and that's not the philosophy we want to just apply a per dollar figure. Really, we want to maximize the existing fleet, and the only way to really do that is to have a good grasp on data and have a data-informed way to understand how the lab is operating, what the efficiencies are, where we can gain additional efficiencies. And I think that we have a significant cut in our CapEx spend. I think, factor, I don't know the exact number, but, about half or something like that, depending on the type of equipment we're looking at, the scope for expansion, the additional groups that we can use for existing pieces of equipment. The data and digitalized way of understanding your lab will significantly save money, increase your efficiency, and that's one of the key things that is part of our operational strategy right now.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And Rowan, you shared a whole bunch already. I don't know if you had any additional ones to share. Otherwise, we can move on to some of the Q&A. But Rowan, did you have anything else?
Well, I need to say that a lab can consume up to 10 times as much energy as an office can. So sometimes when we speak with some of our larger customers, they sometimes don't even have an inventory of the equipment that they have in the lab or know what equipment they've got. So with the sustainability aspect becoming more and more important these days, to be able to get a grasp on that, the only way to do that at the moment is by taking advantage of these digital tools.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we just have enough time for some questions and Q&A, so I'd love to give an opportunity for that. I don't know, Cassie, if you're able to take a look and see if we have any questions that have come through at all, Cassie?
Yeah, definitely. So before we jump into that, I want to thank you all, Jake, Hans, Rowan, and David, for your informative presentations. So as he said, we will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located beneath the slides and click Submit, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for, but I'll go ahead and highlight that Ask a Question box here, so you should see a glowing red band around the question for the live Q&A. So I'll go ahead and get started. Our first question asks, can you add electrical and vent components to the digital lab twins?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. Well, depending on which digital twin you're talking about. If it's regarding the lab design tool itself, yes, we have some of those components in there already and asset tracking capabilities. In fact, we're doing some integrations with different asset environments like even Agilent and others. But those components do exist, but perhaps they're speaking to other digital twin technologies that either Rowan or Jake may be familiar with.
David, can I ask you a question about the system for the lab design tool?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So one of the challenges we faced in not just the Moderna build out, but many build outs I've done for labs is you'll have an architect and they're concerned with getting the large pieces of equipment, backup power, utilities, things like that. But it's not thought about in terms of an operational workflow. So what they don't capture is things that are not necessarily hooked up to power, like metro racks, where are your consumables, stuff like that. How are those ancillary items that are critical for lab function, but not necessarily part of architectural or construction involved in your design tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've actually had a bunch of requests for that, and actually in a quarter or two, we have a whole bunch of features that are being added. So we don't have the ability to track consumables in the product today, but we actually will. Numerous customers have asked us to basically attach metadata to each instrument. So not only can we track electrical and other components, we're now adding the ability to identify and have a checklist of consumables associated with that device or that instrument as one example. And that could be transposed into anything that you wanted to track, but an instrument by instrument basis or in a workflow, because we now have the ability to design a workflow within the lab design tool. And within that workflow, it can have its own metadata as well. So I hope that answers your question. It's a great one. Thank you.
Great. Did we have
Cassie,
any
was there-
more input? I'm sorry about that. What was that?
Oh, sorry. Next question, maybe?
Yes, I wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to answer. Our next question asks, can asset utilization information be integrated between the lab design tool and Agilent core lab solutions?
Well, certainly when, the way that we collect the utilization data, and we can do that in a variety of different ways, either monitoring the electrical signature, so the current signature of an instrument, knowing when it's running and when it's idle, or getting it from data files without affecting data integrity, or from the instrument itself. All that data comes together, and then we collect that in a data warehouse, and that can either go, well, it goes to our dashboards, but we can send that somewhere else. So a bit like an API where you can connect softwares together, that information can go to wherever our customer wants it to go. So if whatever software you want that to go into is able to accept that data as like a CSV file or some kind of database input, then absolutely that utilization data could get in there. I don't know if it can get into the lab design tool. David you might have to help me there.
Yeah, it sure can. So yeah, we have open APIs and we can connect to pretty much any asset system that's out there if that's needed. You can put your asset tags in there and they can coexist between the two systems. Great question.
Excellent. Thank you both. Our next question, it looks like, is for you, Jake. This question asks, what team at Moderna is responsible for approving CapEx for lab planning and optimization, and what is your internal process to get those costs approved?
Funny you mentioned that. My business operations team just spent the last 6 months revising that entire process. So, prior to the last 6 months, it was a cluster. And so now we have a whole spreadsheet. And we built a chart in Lucid with all the different teams. We spent 6 months biweekly meetings with all different teams of facilities, digital, EHS, whoever needs to be a part of ordering equipment, vetting the space for it, vetting the utilities, vetting the computer associated with it. With our facilities team, we're also looking at what's in storage, and that gets vetted before it gets ordered. My team, the lab ops team, works with we use Agilent CrossLab for our equipment support. They give us the data, we import it and analyze it in Tableau for what the power monitoring is. And then based on the utilization, that informs the leadership for approving the CapEx. But there's a whole approval flow with all those teams that, yes, they can vet it. Do we have existing? What is the utilization data? That all funnels up for approval once these teams are individually approved at their level to a senior leadership. To, in my case, it would be my boss, the COO, for research. And they have approval up to a certain dollar level, then that goes beyond them for additional stuff. But that's kind of the overall process, and that informs, do we need this? Do we have this? What is the utilization? And there's a readout that I can provide that says, we're looking at a new Sony sorter flow cytometer. Let's say, here's how many sorters we have, here's utilization percentage. That sort of thing is very helpful for the leadership to make decisions instead of, I think we have a few, I think they're highly utilized. The data-based approach is now very informative to give us a real-time understanding.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
All right, and it looks like due to time, we have time for just one more question. That question asks, how are you using AR and VR for workflow automation within the labs?
That's a great question. I don't know if the other tools are, so I guess I'll speak to the lab design tool. It might be referencing that. So everything you saw on screen for the demonstration, all of that can be automatically implemented in augmented reality, virtual reality. We've got a large independent lab around the country using that to actually have scientists put on VR headsets and optimize their workflows on an ongoing basis. Makes it quite easy to do that. So I think that's the question that's being asked. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Jake, Hans, Rowan, and David for your time today and your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Lab Design Tool, for underwriting this educational webcast. Apologies here. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by our speakers via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.